The winter of 1833 lay over Boston in a heavy, unbroken gray. The harbor's usual clamor came muffled through fog and coal smoke, while iron-rimmed wheels shrieked against ice-slit cobblestones, and the poor wrapped their thin shoulders in rags that barely resisted the Atlantic wind. In the houses that climbed Beacon Hill, lamplight burned late behind drawn curtains as men of means spoke gravely of charity, their concern for the suffering careful never to disturb the comfort of their own tables. The city held in close proximity overflowing tenements and grand churches, sermons on mercy and alleyways full of children with blue fingers and hollow eyes. Into this landscape stepped Dr. Elias Turner, a tall, narrow-shouldered man whose dark wool coat had been brushed so often that it shone faintly at the seams. Hair prematurely silver at the temples, and a high, clear forehead lent him an air both distinguished and fatigued. His face bore the habitual softness of one accustomed to speaking of sorrow, yet his pale blue gaze measured everything it fell upon with an unblinking intentness that made strangers look away first. The scuffs on his polished boots and the worn fingertips of his gloves testified to long travel and careful economy rather than idleness or extravagance. Within a short span of weeks, his name passed easily among Boston's philanthropic circles. Letters of reference, properly sealed and neatly copied, vouched for his service in overcrowded almshouses and hospitals for the indigent, where he attended to those the city preferred not to see. He spoke, in parlors heavy with damask and tobacco, of children sleeping in stairwells and under carts, of mothers who traded their last possessions for medicine that arrived too late. His manner blended modesty with quiet conviction. He admitted to failures and limitations in his past work, insisting that such failures proved the need for better institutions rather than the futility of effort. Clergymen found in him a man who could pass easily from scripture to anatomy. Merchants recognized the efficiency of his plans. Pious widows saw in him a vehicle through which their surplus might become visible virtue. From the outset, he refused offers to join existing homes and asylums. In those, he noted, the poor were stored rather than changed. The city had shelters enough that confined bodies and discarded souls in the name of order. What he proposed instead was an establishment that would take the raw material of the street, orphans and the destitute young, and shape them into something useful, disciplined, and devout. The word he favored for this process was transformation, a term that struck his listeners as at once scientific and scriptural, though few paused to consider how thorough such a transformation might be, or what might be lost in attaining it. The structure he chose for this purpose stood on a bare rise at the edge of the city, where brick streets sank into rutted lanes, and the harbor's reek thinned into the sour smell of damp earth. Once it had housed a modest textile manufactory. Now its long windows were dulled with grime, and its tall chimney rose like a dead tree over the surrounding scrub. Inside, the main hall formed a single vast, echoing space. The ghosts of machinery traced in bolts left in the floor and rust-stained marks along the walls. Dust lay thick over every surface, and the air carried a faint, permanent cold. In this abandoned shell, Turner saw the outline of his design. The central hall, stripped of looms and pulleys, could serve as refectory, assembly space, and chapel. The upper floors could be divided into dormitories and classrooms. The smaller outbuildings could become workshops where idle hands would learn to labor. The hill itself pleased him. Its slight elevation and distance from the close-packed wharves set it apart, close enough to the city to receive a steady stream of children, yet far enough that what happened within its walls would not easily draw the casual eye. During his first inspection, he attended diligently to the practical questions of foundations, walls, and water. The building, though neglected, was sound. The roof demanded repair, the windows new panes, the chimneys cleaning, but the bones held. It was the lower levels, however, that interested him most. A narrow flight of stone steps led down from the rear of the hall into the underlying darkness of the old storage cellars. There the air grew colder and more still, thick with the smell of mold and rust. The low-ceilinged rooms opened off one another in a cramped succession, their stone walls solid and their entrances narrow. Voices, once loosed in such a space, would not travel far. Where the owner's agent saw only damp, useless rooms and a cost to be avoided in bricks and mortar, Turner recognized something else entirely. Foundations, in his view, existed not merely to bear weight, but to hold what should not be seen. A true home, he believed, must be prepared not only to feed and teach its charges, but to contain them in ways they themselves could not fully understand. The upper floors could be flooded with light and scripture, with neat rows of beds and benches. The depths existed for other purposes, for storage of what the institution wished to keep close and quiet, and for work that required stone, distance, and silence. By early spring of 1834, the hill swarmed with hired men. The old smokestack came down brick by brick. In its place, Turner ordered a modest wooden belfry raised, more fitting, he observed, for a place that aspired to call souls rather than pump smoke into the air. Soot-blackened walls were scraped and resurfaced. Broken glass was replaced so that the windows could admit as much light as the New England sky would allow. New partitions rose on the upper floors, dividing former workrooms into straight, narrow dormitories with beds arranged according to exacting measurements. At the foot of the hill, a fresh board announced the institution's name in careful, sober lettering. Mercy Hill, Home for Orphans and the Destitute Poor. Newspapers, when they mentioned the project, did so with approval. At a time when almshouses overflowed and the streets seemed to fill faster than charity could empty them, a privately organized home that promised order and moral improvement fit neatly into prevailing notions of Christian duty. The figure of Dr. Turner, grave, self-effacing, and unconnected to any scandal, suited the city's preference for benevolence that did not unsettle its assumptions about the deserving and undeserving poor. As the building neared completion, Turner assembled his staff with the same deliberation he had applied to brick and timber. A middle-aged widow with experience in the city almshouse accepted the position of matron, drawn by the promise of a cleaner, more orderly work than the chaos she knew. 2 younger women, accustomed to service in respectable households, were hired to assist with the care of the children and the endless round of washing and mending that such care entailed. An elderly schoolmaster, whose health no longer permitted him to manage large classes, was engaged to instruct in letters, figures, and basic catechism. A cook, recommended for her thrift, agreed to make porridge, stews, and coarse bread, sufficient for many from limited supplies. To each of them Turner presented a vision in which discipline and mercy were inseparable. Without order, he maintained, any house for the poor sank quickly into filth and violence. Without the assurance of a higher purpose, discipline decayed into simple cruelty. The children who would come to Mercy Hill would not be pet objects of pity nor nameless burdens. They would, under careful supervision, be shaped into honest laborers and sober servants, bound to society not by blood or inheritance, but by gratitude and habit. In this way, he suggested, suffering could be redeemed into usefulness, and the idle, dangerous mass of the street transformed into something the city might safely absorb. The first child arrived not to trumpets and speeches, but in the gray quiet of a late March evening. There was no gathering of dignitaries, no procession up the hill. The door opened to admit a thin, underfed girl smelling of damp wool and wood smoke, accompanied by a parish curate whose own clothing bore the shine of long wear. The girl carried nothing but the clothes on her back. Parish records provided her age and name. The hollows beneath her eyes and the way she hesitated on the threshold told the rest. Father dead on the docks, mother taken by illness, months of survival by scraps and occasional charity. Such stories had already become so common in Boston that they scarcely shocked those who copied them into ledgers. Mercy Hill received her with tidy efficiency. Her name was entered into a new, leather-bound register in a neat, controlled hand. A number was assigned. The matron supplied a coarse but clean dress, a pair of stockings without holes, boots that had belonged to some earlier, sturdier child. The cook set aside a bowl of hot porridge and a heel of bread. That night she slept in a narrow bed with a straw mattress and 2 blankets, in a room where a dozen other iron frames stood in straight lines beneath the low ceiling. For the parish curate who climbed back down the hill through the evening chill, the sight of the lit windows and the promise of regular meals and schooling were comfort enough. He had delivered one more child from the alley into a place that bore the name of Mercy, and he could report as much to his superiors with a clear conscience. The city at large, hearing such accounts repeated, folded Mercy Hill into its mental catalog of institutions that proved Boston's moral seriousness. There was relief in believing that someone, somewhere, was taking the forgotten children in hand. Within the building, the pattern Turner envisioned began to take shape with scarcely a sound to the outside world. The dormitories filled, one bed after another, with small, wary bodies that were gradually trained to rise, pray, eat, work, and sleep at precisely marked hours. The central hall, once full of clattering machines, now echoed with recitations and hymns. Rules were posted, infractions were noted with meticulous care. Those who adapted quickly were praised with measured approval and minor privileges. Those who resisted found that Mercy Hill, beneath its orderly surface, possessed depths of patience and corrective ingenuity more enduring than their own. Far below, in the stone understructure that most of the staff scarcely thought about and none of the children were permitted to enter, the air remained cold and still. The rooms there waited in the dark, unchanged except for the occasional trace of recent inspection. A swept corner, a repaired latch, a length of chain moved from one hook to another. The building, once a manufactory of cloth, had been remade into a manufactory of souls. It rested firmly on foundations that were stronger and more secluded than any passerby on the muddy road below could guess. The name Mercy Hill, painted in crisp black letters on the sign at the foot of the path, soon came to stand in conversations for thrift and virtue, for the proper management of a growing social problem. Those who praised it most fervently knew least of the hill itself, of the strict geometry of its beds and benches, of the unyielding timetable that governed every movement, and least of all of the quiet waiting spaces beneath the polished floors. Chapter 2. The Perfect Order of Mercy. By the summer of 1834, Boston had grown accustomed to the quiet presence of Mercy Hill on its bare rise beyond the busier streets. The building presented an image of modest propriety. Straight lines, clean windows, a small bell tower rather than an industrial chimney. In newspapers and parlors alike, it was spoken of as evidence that the city did not merely talk about Christian responsibility, but acted upon it. Small figures in plain garments walking in pairs along the lane for Sunday services confirmed for many onlookers that order and charity had found a working partnership there. Inside, that order had already hardened into something far more intricate than any visitor could see. The day at Mercy Hill began before dawn. Long before the city's shopkeepers lifted their shutters, the bell on the hill sent its thin sound down over the frosted fields. In the dormitories, children woke to the same sequence every morning. The sudden clang of the handbell in the corridor, the scrape of boots along the floorboards, the matron's brisk movement between the rows of iron frames. The room, with its low ceiling and neat lines of beds, filled at once with the soft chaos of sleep-blurred bodies sitting up and swinging thin legs to the floor. Within minutes, however, the disorder narrowed into a tight, practiced rhythm. Everything about the dormitories was calculated to teach submission to a pattern larger than any individual will. The beds stood at precise intervals, each with its numbered frame and straw mattress, its pair of folded blankets aligned to an exact margin. At the foot of each bed a wooden box held a child's entire worldly goods, a second set of coarse clothing, a spare pair of stockings, perhaps a ribbon or a small battered book permitted as a reward. Above the rows of frames, the walls bore a few chosen texts, copied in a firm hand, injunctions to diligence, obedience, and humility. From wakefulness, the children moved immediately into the long corridor, where cold air and bare boards reminded them that the heat of sleep was a temporary indulgence. They lined up in twos, smallest at the front, older ones behind, under the watchful eye of Mrs. Hargreaves and her assistants. The march to the refectory was wordless. The great central hall had been divided but not entirely tamed. At its center ran two long tables of unpainted pine, each flanked by benches. A pulpit-like lectern stood at the far end, raised just enough that anyone behind it could see the whole room at a glance. Light entered through the cleaned windows in a pale, diluted wash, never quite reaching the far corners. In the chill of early mornings, breath hung in faint clouds above each child's bowed head. Breakfast was a lesson disguised as nourishment. The fare scarcely varied. Thick porridge, bread that weighed heavy in the hand, occasionally a thin smear of dripping or molasses. Each portion was measured out with an almost sacramental attention to equality, so that no one could claim favoritism and no one could forget how little separated sufficiency from hunger. No one ate until the proper words had been spoken, and the entire company sat in exact stillness. A dropped spoon, a whispered remark, a glance exchanged at the wrong moment. All were noted. Annie Quinn, the first child to cross Mercy Hill's threshold, had learned these rhythms faster than most. Within 3 weeks her hands no longer trembled when she held her spoon. Her eyes remained fixed on her bowl during the morning prayer. When Mrs. Hargreaves passed behind her bench, Annie's shoulders did not flinch. She had discovered what all the children eventually learned, that invisibility within the pattern was the closest thing to safety the institution offered. After the meal, the hall shifted seamlessly into its other roles. Benches were turned, slates and chalk produced, primers placed on the tables according to age and progress. The day's first instruction was religious, passages committed to memory, catechism recited in a steady chorus. The children learned to shape the same words with the same inflections, individual hesitations smoothed away by constant repetition. In this shared, drilled language, the institution began to write itself into their minds. Secular lessons followed, though even these bent toward usefulness. Reading emphasized religious tracts and improving tales. Writing focused on clear, legible hands suitable for ledgers and correspondence. Arithmetic rarely strayed far from the practical, sums that mimicked wages, prices, and measures a servant or clerk might need to reckon. There was little space for questions that did not fit the narrow lane laid out before them. By mid-morning, the youngest children had been moved to a separate room where they picked threads from worn garments under the supervision of one of the younger staff women. Their small fingers worked steadily, pulling apart seams so that usable cloth could be salvaged and sold. The work was tedious enough to occupy their hands, but not so complex that their minds could wander into dangerous territory. Memory, longing, resistance. In the adjacent workshop, older boys repaired shoes and assembled simple wooden items for sale to nearby households. The clatter of hammers and the smell of leather and glue filled the space. A monitor, a 13-year-old who had earned Turner's trust through months of flawless obedience, walked between the workbenches, noting which boys worked steadily and which allowed their attention to drift. His small leather notebook, a gift from the doctor himself, contained careful marks beside each name. The laundry occupied the oldest girls for hours each day. Steam rose from great copper tubs where linens and clothing boiled in water made caustic with lye. The girls' hands, reddened and cracked despite the coarse soap provided for washing afterward, moved through the familiar sequence: scrubbing, wringing, hanging. The work was never finished. As soon as one load dried on the line strung across the yard, another basket of soiled fabric appeared. The rhythm of it, the endless cycle of dirt and cleaning, became a physical manifestation of the institution's central doctrine: that human nature required constant, exhausting correction. Turner appeared in each of these spaces throughout the day, his movements unhurried but purposeful. In the classroom, he paused behind each child just long enough to observe the angle of the hand holding the slate, the formation of letters, the speed of calculation. In the workshops, he watched the movements of arms and shoulders, as if mentally calculating capacities and limits. His presence was rarely announced. Children would look up from their work to find him already standing there, observing. His inspection of individual children followed no obvious pattern, which made prediction impossible and anxiety constant. He might single out a girl for praise, commending the evenness of her stitches or the clarity of her recitation, then grant her a ribbon to wear on Sunday. Or he might pause beside a boy whose work appeared identical to his neighbor's and remark in a tone of quiet disappointment that the effort showed signs of haste. The unpredictability was itself a form of control. It kept every child suspended between hope and dread, unable to find solid ground. Mrs. Hargreaves maintained a different kind of surveillance. Her heavy tread and sharp eyes belonged to someone who believed that vigilance was the truest form of charity. She noticed which children whispered during the evening prayers, who shared their bread with a weaker neighbor, who woke with nightmares and disrupted the dormitory's silence. Each observation found its way into the thick ledger she kept in her small office, a room barely larger than a closet, but positioned so that its single window overlooked both the refectory entrance and the yard. The younger staff women moved more quietly through the building, their supervision less obvious but no less thorough. They had been trained to watch for patterns rather than individual infractions. Which child grew listless despite adequate food, who resisted the rhythm of the day with increasing stubbornness, who comforted others a little too freely and might therefore become a center of loyalty outside the approved hierarchy. These observations, recorded in neat handwriting, accumulated in Turner's private study. Every deviation from the expected rhythm, illness, defiance, persistent melancholy, became a line entry, something to be weighed against the larger ledger of obedience and potential. A child who fell ill was isolated not merely for contagion's sake, but to observe whether the illness brought out complaints, tears, or demands for comfort. One who recovered without fuss earned a small notation of approval. One who wept or called for a mother long dead earned a different kind of attention. The system of punishments operated with mechanical consistency. Minor infractions brought loss of small privileges, the withholding of a second ladle of porridge, a reduction in the brief period of free time before evening prayers, the removal of a blanket for a single cold night. More serious disobedience resulted in isolation on a hard chair at the edge of the hall, eyes fixed forward while others ate or recited. The child remained there for hours, visible to all, a living warning. Physical correction existed but left no lasting marks, administered with a strap kept in Mrs. Hargreaves' office and applied with measured force to palms rather than backs. Against this constant possibility of loss stood a carefully structured ladder of earned favor. Those who displayed punctual obedience and quick learning received small tokens of distinction. A child might be entrusted to carry a key, to distribute slates, to read aloud on behalf of the others. These privileges, minor as they were, created a visible hierarchy that turned the children's attention inward, toward competition with one another rather than resistance to the system itself. The role of monitor represented the highest achievement available to an orphan at Mercy Hill. Monitors were given authority to oversee younger children, to report infractions, to enforce silence during prohibited hours. They wore a strip of blue cloth on their sleeves and carried small notebooks for recording observations. Turner selected them personally, always choosing those who had demonstrated not merely obedience, but enthusiasm for the institution's logic. These children had learned to see their own survival as inseparable from the maintenance of the order that confined them. They became the system's most effective enforcers precisely because they believed in it. By autumn of 1834, the register had thickened considerably. New children arrived every few weeks, some brought by parish officials, others by desperate mothers who believed they were surrendering their sons and daughters to a better life than the streets could offer. Each arrival followed the same sequence: name recorded, number assigned, clothing exchanged for the institution's plain uniform, a bowl of porridge and a night's sleep in a narrow bed. By the second day, the new child had been placed within the pattern according to age and capacity. By the end of the first week, the edges of their former selves had begun to blur. Yet not every child who passed through Mercy Hill's doors remained visible in its daily routines. Some were said to have been placed in service with respectable households after proving their reliability and training. Others, according to official records, had been reclaimed by distant relations located through Turner's tireless correspondence. These explanations satisfied most who heard them. The city's burden, measured in bodies wandering its alleys, seemed to lighten by degrees, and few asked uncomfortable questions when the ledger appeared to balance. What the ledger did not show were the children who had been moved to different accommodations within the building itself. A girl prone to violent nightmares that disturbed the dormitory was relocated to a smaller room on the ground floor, officially described as an infirmary, though it contained only a single iron cot and a bucket. A boy who had attempted twice to run was placed in what Turner termed protective isolation, a windowless chamber in the building's oldest section where the walls were stone and the door was solid oak, reinforced with iron bands. These relocations were presented to the staff as necessary measures for the good of the many. A disruptive child, left among the others, could spread restlessness like contagion. Better to separate the troubled few so that the majority could continue their progress undisturbed. Mrs. Hargreaves accepted this reasoning without question. The younger women, if they harbored doubts, kept them silent. The monitors, who saw these removals as proof of their own superior adaptation, reported any sympathy expressed by their peers. The lower chambers, those stone rooms beneath the main hall that had been dismissed during the initial inspection as mere storage, had acquired new furnishings by year's end. Shelves lined some walls, though what they held remained obscured by canvas covers. In one room, a sturdy wooden table had been installed, its surface scrubbed clean but bearing faint stains that repeated washing could not entirely remove. Lengths of chain and iron cuffs hung from hooks set deep into the stone. The air down there remained perpetually cold, thick with damp and the metallic smell of rust, and something sharper that might have been vinegar, or might have been something else. Turner descended into these spaces alone, carrying a lamp whose light threw his shadow long and distorted against the low ceiling. He moved methodically, checking the security of locks, the condition of restraints, the inventory of bottles and instruments arranged on the covered shelves. His journal, kept in a locked drawer in his study, recorded observations in the same neat hand he used for official reports. Measurements, reactions to various stimuli, the effects of isolation and deprivation on behavior and cognition. The language was clinical, detached, as if the subjects under examination were specimens rather than children. No sound from these depths reached the dormitories above. The stone was too thick, the distance too great. When a child who had been relocated eventually returned to the general population, pale, silent, and more obedient than before, the others learned not to ask where they had been. Questions led to attention, and attention from Turner often preceded relocation of one's own. On Sunday afternoons, when the weather permitted, visitors from Boston's philanthropic circles arrived to tour the institution. They were guided along a carefully planned route, through the refectory where children sat in neat rows, past the classrooms where slates displayed properly formed letters, into the workshops where industry hummed with apparent contentment. The visitors saw clean floors, adequate if plain food, children who stood and recited on command. They left reassured that their donations were being put to proper use, that Mercy Hill represented progress in the humane management of poverty. What they did not see were the isolation rooms, the monitors' notebooks, the ledgers that tracked more than just names and numbers. They did not hear the bells that regulated every waking moment, or witness the blank compliance that hunger and exhaustion produced. They certainly did not descend the narrow stairs to the stone chambers where Turner conducted his more intensive observations. The tour ended always in the front hall, where Turner thanked them for their support and assured them that every child at Mercy Hill was being prepared for a useful, godly life. By winter, the pattern had become self-sustaining. The children who had arrived in spring now moved through their days with mechanical precision. They rose, worked, ate, prayed, and slept according to rhythms so deeply ingrained that deviation seemed not merely forbidden, but unthinkable. The institution had written itself into their bodies, their habits, their expectations. Even in sleep, some of them maintained the rigid posture required during waking hours, lying flat on their backs with hands folded across their chests. Annie Quinn, who had once flinched at every sudden sound, now served as a monitor. The blue cloth on her sleeve marked her elevation. Her small notebook contained careful observations about the younger girls in her charge, who whispered after lights were extinguished, who failed to finish their portions, who showed signs of homesickness or rebellion. She recorded these things without evident emotion, her face as blank as those she watched. When Turner praised her diligence, she accepted the compliment with a small curtsy and downcast eyes, exactly as she had been taught. The hill itself stood silent against the winter sky, its windows glowing faintly in the early dark. Smoke rose straight from its chimneys. The bell in its modest tower rang at precise intervals, marking the divisions of the day. From the road below, Mercy Hill appeared as it was meant to appear, orderly, purposeful, unremarkable, a solution to a problem the city preferred not to examine too closely. Inside, in the stone-cold depths beneath the polished floors, the real work of the institution continued in darkness and silence, refining its methods with each new subject, perfecting the machinery of transformation, one small life at a time. The autumn of 1835 brought changes to Mercy Hill that passed largely unnoticed by the city below. The register now contained over 90 names. The dormitories had expanded into the attic space, and a second workshop operated in one of the outbuildings. To Boston's charitable committees, these developments represented success, efficiency, self-sufficiency, and the transformation of burden into productivity. What did not appear in any report was the concurrent expansion of the institution's hidden architecture. Through late summer, workers excavated 3 additional chambers beyond the original cellars. Turner had selected them carefully. Men with debts, men whose reputations made them unemployable elsewhere, men who understood that silence purchased continued work. The construction proceeded during daylight hours when the children remained confined to their routines above, the sound of picks and shovels muffled by stone and earth. By October, the workers had been dismissed with final payments that included implicit compensation for discretion. The new chambers bore no resemblance to storage spaces. Their walls had been whitewashed, their floors sloped toward drains, their furnishings arranged with systematic precision. One room contained an examination table. Another held restraints of varying sizes. The largest space held shelves of glass bottles, metal instruments, and leather-bound journals, whose pages filled steadily with Turner's meticulous script. The purpose of these chambers, as recorded in those private journals, was what Turner termed corrective observation. His public philosophy held that poverty resulted from moral deficiency that could be remedied through discipline. His private investigations pursued a more ambitious hypothesis, that human obedience and behavior could be measured, refined, and perfected through systematic study. The subjects for these investigations were selected with care. Children who had no known relatives, who had arrived without parish records, who had been relinquished completely by families who signed away all parental rights. These disappeared from the dormitories with minimal disruption. A notation in the register indicated transfer to specialized care or placement in service, phrases deliberately vague. The other children, accustomed by now to sudden absences and the danger of questions, learned to forget the missing faces. Once relocated, a child entered an environment designed to strip away identity. The rooms were windowless, lit by lamps that burned or were extinguished according to experimental protocols. Time lost its divisions. There were no bells, no meals at regular intervals. The uncertainty itself became a tool, teaching that survival depended entirely on the observer's will. Turner descended to these chambers daily with his lamp and journal. His notes recorded measurements and observations in the dispassionate tone of scientific inquiry, describing subjects by number rather than name. He drew from multiple sources. Medical texts provided anatomical knowledge, religious treatises supplied theoretical justification for suffering as pedagogy, mental philosophy offered concepts about habit and the plasticity of character. What he created was unprecedented, a systematic program for remaking human beings according to his specifications. The methods remain incompletely documented. Turner's later journals were destroyed, and what survived offers only fragments. What is clear is that physical examinations formed the foundation, that isolation and sensory deprivation proved particularly effective, and that his investigations distinguished between corrective procedures and what he called investigative study. The careful ambiguity of his surviving language suggests deliberate evasion, phrases that gesture toward practices he chose not to commit fully to writing. Yet the results manifested clearly in the institution's public operations. Children who completed their time in the lower chambers and returned to the dormitories displayed obedience that exceeded ordinary compliance. They moved with mechanical precision, their faces blank, their responses instant and unthinking. They never complained, never resisted, never showed emotion beyond what was required. Turner called them, in his private terminology, perfected subjects. These perfected subjects served multiple purposes. Their absolute reliability made them ideal for positions requiring trust, distributing supplies, supervising younger children, assisting with records. Their transformation also provided visible proof to the staff that even resistant cases could be corrected through proper treatment. The lesson was clear. Resistance was not merely punished, but erased. By winter of 1835, Turner maintained what his journals indicated were 5 such cases in various stages of transformation. Mrs. Hargreaves permitted limited knowledge of the underground work, viewed it as necessary treatment for particularly troubled children whose moral deficiencies exceeded what ordinary discipline could address. Her role was custodial, delivering meals, maintaining cleanliness, ensuring that no disease spread to the general population. Turner documented each case meticulously, filling journals with observations and theoretical refinements. He envisioned his methods being adopted by other institutions, creating a network of asylums that could process the dangerous classes into useful laborers through systematic re-education. By early 1836, he had developed a classification system for incoming children, sorting them not merely by age and capacity for work, but by their potential value as experimental subjects. A third category existed as well: children whose frailties made them unsuitable for either labor or study, consuming resources without producing value. The fate of this category remained obscured even in Turner's private journals. Entries noted only that certain subjects had been removed from active study and their records closed. The careful ambiguity suggested that Turner preferred not to commit certain actions to writing, even in documents he believed private. Above these operations, Mercy Hill's public face continued to earn praise. Reports emphasized the number of children housed, the skills taught, the orderly routine. Visitors toured the upper floors, marveling at the discipline. Donations increased. Turner spoke at philanthropic gatherings about moral reclamation and the perfectibility of the depraved through proper guidance. His reputation grew precisely because he understood what his audience wished to hear: that poverty could be managed through systematic intervention, that the children of the streets could be rendered harmless and useful, that charity need not be sentimental, but could be efficient and measurable. Each speech, each report, each carefully staged tour reinforced the fiction that Mercy Hill was exactly what it claimed to be. The hill stood against the winter sky, smoke rising from its chimneys, windows glowing faintly in the early dark. From the road below it appeared solid and permanent. Within its walls and beneath its foundations, two institutions functioned in careful parallel, one visible and praised, the other hidden and increasingly ambitious. The distance between them was measured not in physical space, but in the depth of deception required to maintain both, and in the progressive erosion of whatever moral constraints had once limited how far Turner was willing to descend. The spring of 1856 arrived late in Boston, reluctant and gray, with rain that turned the unpaved streets to mud and filled the harbor with a cold, restless chop. 22 years had passed since Mercy Hill first opened its doors, and in that span, the institution had become as fixed a part of the landscape as the churches and counting houses below it. The building had aged well, its stone darkened but solid, its bell still marking the hours with mechanical precision. To those who bothered to look up at it from the road, it remained what it had always appeared to be: orderly, respectable, unremarkable. But institutions, like bodies, carry their histories in ways not always visible until something ruptures. Turner himself had aged considerably. At 63, his hair had gone entirely white, his shoulders stooped beneath the weight of decades spent in lamplight and stone-cold air. His hands, once steady enough for the finest surgical work, now trembled slightly when he wrote, though his script remained as meticulous as ever. He moved more slowly through the building's corridors, pausing sometimes as if listening for sounds only he could hear. The staff, grown accustomed to his habits over the years, marked these changes without comment. Mrs. Hargreaves had been replaced by a younger woman after the former matron's death in 1849, and the newer staff knew Turner only as he was now: distant, exacting, prone to long silences. What they did not know was that the underground chambers had been sealed for nearly 3 years. The decision to close them had not been made lightly or suddenly. Throughout the 1840s, Turner's investigations had continued with systematic intensity, his journals filling with observations and measurements that grew increasingly abstract and detached from their human subjects. He had perfected his methods to a degree that satisfied his initial hypotheses. Human behavior could indeed be radically altered through controlled application of isolation, deprivation, and psychological reconditioning. The question was no longer whether such transformations were possible, but whether they served any purpose beyond the act of transformation itself. By the early 1850s, Turner had begun to recognize patterns he had not anticipated. The perfected subjects, while absolutely obedient, proved fragile in unexpected ways. They functioned efficiently within the narrow parameters they had been conditioned to accept, but showed no capacity for adaptation when circumstances changed. Several had simply ceased functioning when removed from the institution's routines, collapsing into catatonia when placed in service positions that required even minimal independent judgment. Others had died young, their bodies succumbing to illnesses that should not have been fatal, as if the will to survive had been erased along with their capacity for resistance. More troubling still were the subjects who had not broken cleanly, but had fractured in ways Turner could not predict or control. These individuals moved through the world with a hollowness that disturbed even those who had no knowledge of their history. They spoke when spoken to, performed tasks when instructed, but displayed an absence of affect that marked them as fundamentally wrong. Some had been returned to Mercy Hill after their placements failed, and Turner had found no way to reverse what he had done. They remained in the institution, neither fully functional nor entirely broken, occupying beds and consuming resources while producing nothing. The economic calculus had shifted as well. The income generated by selling perfected subjects into service had initially supplemented the institution's finances, But as failures accumulated and reputations spread quietly among potential employers, demand had diminished. The process itself was expensive in ways Turner had not fully accounted for. The time required, the resources consumed, the risk of discovery as the number of subjects increased. By 1853, the underground operations had become a liability rather than an asset. The final impetus for closure came from an unexpected source. In the autumn of that year, a physician in Salem had written to Turner requesting information about certain anatomical specimens that had been supplied to his medical school 2 decades earlier. The letter was carefully worded, expressing curiosity rather than suspicion, but Turner recognized the danger immediately. Records existed, bills of sale, shipping manifests, correspondence that could connect Mercy Hill to transactions that might, in retrospect, invite uncomfortable questions. He spent weeks systematically destroying documents, burning journals and ledgers whose absence he convinced himself would never be noticed. The chambers themselves were emptied, their contents removed over the course of several months during hours when the building above slept. The examination table was disassembled and buried in a section of the yard where expansion of the vegetable garden provided cover for disturbed earth. The restraints, the instruments, the bottles of chemicals, all were disposed of with the same meticulous care Turner had once applied to their use. The rooms were scrubbed clean, their drains flushed repeatedly until no trace remained of what had passed through them. The doors were locked, and their keys hidden in a place known only to Turner. For 3 years the sealed chambers had remained undisturbed, and the institution above had continued its ordinary operations without them. Children still arrived, were processed into the system, and emerged eventually as laborers and servants. The methods were gentler now, or at least less intensive. Discipline and routine rather than systematic destruction of the self. Turner told himself that this was sufficient, that his earlier work had been a necessary phase of inquiry, but one that could now be left behind. Yet he descended the stairs sometimes in the deep hours of the night, standing at the locked doors with a lamp in his trembling hand, listening to the silence beyond. What he had not accounted for, in all his careful planning, was the building itself. The foundations that had been excavated and expanded, the walls that had been whitewashed and scrubbed, the drains that had carried away so much. These retained their own memory. Stone holds cold and damp. It holds also the invisible accumulation of years. In the spring of 1856, as the late rains saturated the ground and the old drainage system struggled with the volume of water, something shifted in the earth beneath Mercy Hill. The first sign came on a morning in early April when the cook descended to the cellars to retrieve stored potatoes and found water pooling on the floor. She reported this to the new matron, who reported it to Turner. He inspected the cellar himself, noting the dampness spreading from the far wall where the sealed chambers lay beyond. His initial assessment attributed the problem to the season's unusual rainfall and the age of the building's infrastructure. He hired a local man to examine the drainage, carefully supervising the work to ensure the man ventured no further than the legitimate storage areas. The drainage repairs seemed to resolve the immediate problem, but within a week new issues appeared. A smell began to permeate the lower levels of the building, faint at first, but growing steadily stronger. A sour, organic stench that no amount of scrubbing could eliminate. The children in the ground floor dormitories complained of it. Several developed coughs and fevers. Turner ordered the affected rooms evacuated, and the children moved to the attic spaces, citing concerns about miasma and contagion. He spent long hours in the cellars with buckets of lye and lime, attempting to identify and eliminate the source of the odor. But the smell was not the worst of it. On a night in late April, one of the younger staff members came to Turner's study in a state of barely controlled panic. She had been making a final round of the dormitories when she heard sounds from below, not the ordinary creaks and settles of an old building, but something rhythmic and deliberate. Footsteps, she insisted, though she knew no one should be in the cellars at that hour. and voices, or something like voices, though she could not make out words. Turner descended immediately with a lamp, moving through the storage areas with systematic thoroughness. He found nothing. No intruder, no evidence of disturbance, only the persistent smell and the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness beyond the sealed doors. He returned to the surface and assured the staff member that old buildings made strange noises, that imagination amplified ordinary sounds in the night, that there was nothing to fear. But he heard them himself 2 nights later. Not footsteps exactly, but something moving in the sealed spaces, and beneath that, a sound that might have been breathing, or might have been water, moving through forgotten channels. By May, the situation had deteriorated beyond what could be easily concealed. The smell had spread throughout the building, penetrating the dormitories and refectory despite Turner's increasingly desperate efforts at ventilation and fumigation. Several children had fallen seriously ill, their fevers resistant to treatment. 2 had died, their small bodies wrapped and buried in the institution's modest cemetery with minimal ceremony. The staff grew nervous, speaking in whispers about bad air and cursed ground, old superstitions that Turner had no patience for but could not entirely dismiss. The benefactors, who had largely left Mercy Hill to manage itself over the years, began to ask questions. Letters arrived requesting assurance that the institution remained healthy and well managed, that the recent deaths were unfortunate but not indicative of systemic problems. Turner responded with his customary precision, providing explanations rooted in medical theory and seasonal illness patterns. But he knew that continued problems would eventually require outside inspection, and inspection would mean access to areas he had kept sealed and secret for years. On a night in mid-May, Turner made his decision. He would open the chambers himself, assess whatever damage the water and time had caused, and if necessary complete their destruction by bringing down the ceilings and burying everything beneath rubble and earth. It would be explained as necessary structural work, the removal of unstable cellars that threatened the building's foundations. No one would question it. No one would know what was truly being erased. He descended the stairs alone, carrying his lamp and the keys he had hidden years before. The smell grew stronger as he approached the sealed doors, and the sound of water was now unmistakable. Not dripping, but flowing, as if the channels he had so carefully constructed had reversed their function and were now bringing something back rather than carrying it away. His hands shook as he fitted the first key into its lock. The mechanism resisted, corroded by damp and disuse, but finally yielded with a grinding shriek of metal on metal. The door swung inward on hinges that had frozen partly open, revealing darkness beyond the lamp's reach and a rush of cold air that carried with it the full force of the stench. Not decay exactly, but something older and more fundamental, the smell of earth and water and things that should have remained buried. Turner stepped across the threshold, raising his lamp to illuminate the chamber beyond. The floor was covered in several inches of black water that reflected the light in fractured patterns. The whitewashed walls were streaked with moisture and discolored with blooms of mold that spread in patterns almost too regular to be natural. And there, at the far side of the room where the examination table had once stood, something moved in the shadows. A shifting of darkness against darkness that made the lamp flame gutter and nearly die. He should have retreated then. He should have sealed the door again, brought the ceiling down, burned the entire structure if necessary. But Turner had spent 22 years cultivating detachment, training himself to observe without flinching, to record without feeling. That discipline, which had served him for so long, now held him frozen as the darkness gathered itself and moved forward into the light. What he saw in that moment would never be fully recorded. His journal for that night contained only a single line, written in a hand so unsteady as to be barely legible. They are still here. All of them. Changed. By morning, Turner had barricaded himself in his study, refusing to speak to staff or answer the door. The smell had worsened, spreading through the entire building. The children in the dormitories began to display symptoms beyond physical illness. Night terrors, waking hallucinations, episodes of violent behavior wholly inconsistent with years of conditioning. The staff, their own nerves frayed beyond endurance, began to abandon their posts. By mid-June, Mercy Hill was in chaos. The authorities were summoned finally by a parish official who had come to inquire about a child placed there years before, and found instead a scene of inexplicable disorder. What they discovered in their investigation would eventually be filed in reports that remained sealed for decades afterward. Incomplete accounts of underground chambers, fragmentary records of practices that defied explanation, and testimony from Turner himself that grew increasingly incoherent before he lapsed into permanent silence. The building was evacuated, and the remaining children dispersed to other institutions. Turner was committed to an asylum, where he lived for 3 more years without speaking another word. Mercy Hill stood empty for a time, its reputation sufficiently tainted that no purchaser could be found. Eventually it was torn down, the cellars filled with rubble, and the land sold for development that never materialized. But the records remained, scattered through archives and sealed files, waiting for those who might piece together what had truly been built on that lonely hill, and what had finally refused to stay buried.